July 27th, 1960, New York City. Ethel Voynich, writer and musician, dies at her home at 450 West 24th Street, aged 96. Best known for her 1897 debut novel, The Gadfly, she left behind no children or close relatives, having outlived her husband by 3 decades. In accordance with her will, her body was cremated and her ashes scattered over Central Park. Her remaining possessions fell to her friend and companion, Anne Nill, with whom she had shared her apartment for the last third of her life. But amongst these possessions, there was one item that stood out. Over the last 30 years, its fate had troubled both Mrs. Voynich and her husband before her, so much so that it had remained sealed within a bank vault throughout much of this time. It comprised of a small manuscript bound in a plain brown cover that bore neither a title nor a name. Inside it was tucked a letter, the envelope of which contained a message written in Ethel's handwriting. Its text reads as follows: "Concerning the cipher manuscript, not to be opened till after my death, and then only by A.M. Nill or one other responsible person in place of her." At first glance, the manuscript in question appeared unimportant. Barely larger than a modern paperback, age and wear had reduced it to a sorry condition. Its plain cover hung limp and battered, whilst the parchment within was faded from centuries of age. In places, burrowing insects had dug small holes through its leaves, whilst its edges bore labels, stretch marks, and other blemishes left by its prior owners. Yet despite its lacklustre outer appearance, the manuscript was unique. Beneath its drab cover lay page after page of meticulously drafted writing, transcribed in an unknown language. Along with these writings lay dozens of bizarre and often unidentifiable sketches, which in turn had been roughly daubed with paints of red, green, yellow, and blue. It was this combination of unreadable text and strange imagery that compelled Ethel's husband, the bookseller and former revolutionary Wilfred M. Voynich, to keep the manuscript within his possession for so long. For the rest of his life, he would attempt to decode it, hoping that by doing so he might entice a buyer to pay the astronomical sum he demanded. Between Ethel and himself, the manuscript remained in the Voynich's possession for over half a century. Yet within a year of Ethel's death, its new owner would sell it on for a small fortune. The buyer in turn hoped to resell it at a profit, but as with the Voyniches before him, this goal eluded him. By the end of the decade, he had given up. In 1969, he donated the book to Yale University, where it has remained the object of study by linguists and cryptographers alike. The arrival of the internet in the late 90s would bring the manuscript to the attention of the general public, and over the last 2 decades, interest in its content has only increased. In that time, large numbers of conspiracy theories have grown up around it, whilst dozens of more reputable observers have volunteered their own conclusions as to its content and origin. In 2019 alone, 2 more academics have come forward with claims of having solved the manuscript, though their findings have been met with dismissal by the wider Voynich community. Despite these repudiations, interest in the manuscript only continues to increase, as observers both serious and casual attempt to answer just one question. What does the Voynich manuscript say? For nearly 600 years, the Voynich manuscript has lain undeciphered. In that time, both amateurs and professional cryptographers alike have attempted to decode the strange language that lies within. During its long history, it has drawn the attention of Renaissance alchemists, turn-of-the-century revolutionaries, and leading cryptographers of both world wars. Throughout this time, its cipher has remained stubbornly intact, resisting both traditional code-breaking efforts and sophisticated computer analysis alike. So what is the Voynich Manuscript? On face value, it appears as a small medieval codex containing around 240 pages, whilst perhaps another 30 are now lost. These pages are roughly sorted into 18 quires and are covered in carefully plotted text. Illustrations also appear in large quantities throughout the manuscript, and several folios contain fold-out pages for this purpose. These illustrations are in turn coated in paints of blue, red, yellow and green, which are often crudely applied. And whilst the text itself remains undeciphered, these illustrations can be used to sort the manuscript into distinct sections. It opens with an extensive botanical section, consisting of detailed drawings of plants and herbs. This section comprises a third of the entire manuscript, and is split into several parts, indicating that the current order of folios differs from the original. The second and third sections of the manuscript focus on cosmology and astrology, as indicated by the presence of recognisable zodiac symbols, along with detailed astrological charts. But it is the fourth section of the manuscript that has baffled scholars the most. Here, repeated drawings are shown of naked women bathing in strange intestine-like baths, which are in turn filled with an unknown green fluid. No exact analogue to these bathing arrangements has yet been demonstrated. The next section includes more images of herbs, along with what resemble traditional storage vessels used in medieval Europe. The manuscript concludes with an extended block of text, known to scholars as the recipes section. In addition to these illustrations, the manuscript is littered throughout with other bizarre imagery. On one folio, a small image of a dragon can be seen, feeding on the leaves of a herb. On another, what appears to be a sketch of a corpse can be found in the bottom corner, whilst the largest foldout contains images of a castle hidden within its diagrams. A more mundane example can be found in the margin of the final page of the manuscript, where a small image of a goat rests above that of a naked woman. In recent years, the manuscript has undergone sophisticated computational analysis in hopes of unlocking the text, along with detailed forensic examination. Whilst none of these efforts has succeeded in decoding its contents, the latter has shed some light on its earliest owners. Combined with new documents that have come to light over the last few decades, it is now possible for us to compose a relatively coherent history of the manuscript. Yet the main questions remain unsolved. What does the text of the manuscript say? And who was the elusive writer behind its construction? The continuing levels of interest in the manuscript make it likely that these questions will be answered one day, presuming that a real document lies behind the text. Until then, if we wish to understand the potential origins of the manuscript and why it has retained such enduring interest over the years, we must first examine its often equally bizarre history. And before we can do that, we must delve back into the world of ancient cryptography and see what might have inspired someone to write such a manuscript in the first place. Since the dawn of civilization, people and states alike have sought to hide their secrets. Over the last 4 millennia, countless methods have been employed in this pursuit. The Greek historian Herodotus outlines one of the earliest known accounts of the use of hidden messages, wherein a tablet covered in wax is used to smuggle details to the Spartans of a planned invasion by the Persian king Xerxes. In ancient China, messages were written on small portions of fine silk, which were then coated in wax and swallowed by their prospective messenger. It is in parallel to this practice of hidden messages, known as Steganography, that another method of concealing messages was developed. This approach can be traced back almost 4,000 years to the time of ancient Egypt. Here in the town of Menit Khufu, basic hieroglyphic transformations were developed that served to hide the details of certain religious texts, with the aim of increasing their mystery and arcane properties. This quasi-cryptography proved short-lived, but centuries later the idea would reappear. In Mesopotamia, the world's oldest known encipherment appears on a small cuneiform tablet dating from around 1500 BC. Found on the banks of the river Tigris, it contains an enciphered formula for pottery glaze, a professional secret that its owner would have guarded jealously. In ancient India, the art of cryptography, or secret writing, was developed enough that it is mentioned in the ancient Sanskrit treatise, the Arthasastra, along with in the famous erotic work, the Kama Sutra. Here it is listed as one of the 64 arts, or yogas, that women should know and practice. In the ancient Greek poem, the Iliad, the only reference to writing is to an enciphered tablet meant to ensure the death of its bearer upon its delivery. In a more historical example, the Greeks were also responsible for the first known system of military cryptography. Known as the cytale, this method was developed by the Spartans during the Peloponnesian War and consisted of a secret message written onto parchment that had been wrapped around a wooden staff. When the parchment was unwound, the disconnected letters would become unintelligible, only regaining their coherency if wrapped around a staff of the same thickness. Roman field commanders would also employ ciphers to conceal their messages. In his Lives of the 12 Caesars, the writer Suetonius details a cipher used by Julius Caesar himself, wherein each letter of the alphabet was substituted for that 3 letters down. In post-Roman times, the scholars of the Islamic caliphates would develop these ciphers further. In 815 AD, the Abbasid caliph Al-Mamun established a centre for translation in Baghdad, fueling the pursuit of both secular and religious knowledge. It was amongst this rush to acquire knowledge that the first major breakthrough in the art of code-breaking was made. In the mid-9th century, Abu Yusuf al-Kindi, also known as the father of Arab philosophy, discovered that variations in letter frequency could be exploited to break ciphers. Throughout this same time, Western cryptography remained comparatively limited. During the early Middle Ages, most Western cryptographic work comprised of monastic studies of encipherments contained within the biblical Old Testament. The earliest known Western work on cryptography wasn't composed until the 13th century, when the philosopher and Franciscan friar Roger Bacon composed an epistle on the secret workings of art and the nullity of magic. This manuscript detailed 7 methods for encrypting a message, and included the caution that a man is crazy who writes a secret in any other way than one which will conceal it from the vulgar. Over the next 2 centuries, the use of ciphers would grow increasingly common in Western Europe. Italy in particular became a hotbed of cryptographic development, as competing city-states attempted to outmaneuver their neighbours. By the 15th century, ambassadors and diplomats would pass enciphered messages to their respective heads of state, whilst early alchemists and scientists would commonly encipher their work materials to disguise their ideas. Perhaps the most famous example of this can be found in the workbooks of Leonardo da Vinci, which are enciphered against casual eyes by a combination of mirror writing and abbreviations. It is amongst this backdrop of secrecy and professional jealousy that we find what for a long time was considered the only mention of the Voynich Manuscript prior to the 20th century. It occurs in the form of a letter sent in 1665 by the Bohemian doctor and alchemist Jan Marek Marci to the Jesuit scholar and polymath Athanasius Kircher. This letter remained within the manuscript for the next 2.5 centuries, and was still within its cover when it came into Wilfrid Voynich's possession. In it, Marci states that he is sending Kircher an enciphered manuscript left to him by a late friend. If we are to believe Marci, then this manuscript had been the object of obsessive and ultimately failed study by its late owner, who had previously sent copies of the manuscript to Kircher for study. After stating that he believed only Kircher would be capable of deciphering the text, he also passes on information he claims to have received from one Dr. Raphael, that the manuscript once belonged to the late Emperor Rudolf II, who he claimed paid the princely sum of 600 ducats to acquire it. Raphael also related to him the claim that the manuscript was composed by none other than the previously mentioned Roger Bacon, a claim on which Marci declines to pass judgment. This letter apparently went without reply from Kircher, despite the existence of 2 follow-up letters sent on Marcy's behalf by a colleague, Gottfried Kinner. Until the late 90s, this letter formed the core of knowledge on the early history of the Voynich Manuscript. Between them, they pinpoint the likely locations of the manuscript at this time, first in 17th century Bohemia, then at the Collegio Romano in Rome, where Kircher taught and conducted research until his death. Indeed, it is knowledge of this second location that has allowed researchers to track the manuscript all the way to its current location. But this letter leaves open several questions. Who was the previous owner that Marcy mentions? If the manuscript had indeed belonged to Rudolf II, then how had this earlier owner acquired it, and what previously led Rudolf to seek it out? And crucially, is there any truth to the claim that Roger Bacon was the author behind the manuscript? Well, thanks to a number of discoveries over the last 2 decades, we can now answer most of these questions. Let's start with the identity of the earlier owner mentioned in Marcy's letter. For a long time, it was theorized that this owner was a man by the name of Georgius Bartius, a minor alchemist who had served as a legal official at the Prague Court of Justice. Indeed, it was known that after his death sometime before 1665, he had left his alchemical collection and library to his friend Marcy, who had likely also inherited the manuscript at this point. However, this thread wasn't fully confirmed until 1999, when Kircher's full correspondence was published online. Included amongst this correspondence was a letter that had indeed been written by Bartius. Dating from the 12th of April 1639, the letter is written in a tone that its translator, Philip Neal, described as self-important and pompous. In it, Bartius compliments Kircher on his recent publication of a dictionary of the Coptic language, only to rapidly switch to outlining his difficulties in decoding a manuscript in his possession. He goes on to detail the manuscript at some length, with the description he provides closely matching that of the Voynich Manuscript. Quote, "From the pictures of herbs, of which there are a great many in the Codex, and of varied images, stars, and other things bearing the appearance of chemical symbolism, it is my guess that the whole thing is medical, the most beneficial branch of learning for the human race apart from the salvation of souls." Throughout the remainder of the letter, he expounds on his theories as to what it may contain, and begs Kircher to apply himself to its solution. In aid of this, Bartius also seems to have enclosed partial copies he had made of the manuscript, noting that he had done the same in prior correspondence with Kircher. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given the letter's tone, Kircher never seems to have replied. The copies of the manuscript made by Bartius are now lost, and until recently the same was assumed to be true of Bartius's earlier attempt at contacting Kircher. However, in the late 2000s, Czech historian Josef Smolka discovered that Kircher had in fact replied to Bartius's previous inquiries, which were passed to him by the mathematician Theodor Moretus. It was his return letter to Moretus that likely sparked Bartius's second attempt at correspondence, which came only 6 weeks after Kircher's reply. In this letter, Kircher replies somewhat coolly that the manuscript would take no great work of genius on his behalf to decipher, but that he was busy with far more pressing tasks. This response is perhaps to be expected, given what we know of Kircher's life. Simply put, at this time Kircher was indisputably the preeminent scholar of his day, pursuing a wide range of interests that included pioneering studies into Egyptian hieroglyphics, microbiology, geology, and fossil structure. Over the course of his life, he also maintained a wide-ranging correspondence with important rulers of the time, including the Holy Roman Emperors Ferdinand II and III, along with several popes. As such, he likely would have considered an unsolicited cipher posed to him by an obscure Bohemian alchemist to be of low priority. Kircher may also have been motivated by his known distaste for alchemy and its practitioners, though Marcy did his best to assure Kircher of Bartius's good intentions in a letter of his own sent a year later. Furthermore, from the date of Bartius's letter, we now know the likely reason for him refusing to send the manuscript to Kircher at this time, as their correspondence took place in the final stages of the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War was up to that point the most damaging conflict in European history. Its origins lay in the mid-16th century emergence of the Protestant Reformation, which by the early 17th century had spread throughout much of the Holy Roman Empire. Throughout this time, religious tension had slowly built up between the Catholic and Protestant princes, while successive emperors pursued policies of benign neglect. Hostilities had already broken out by 1618, but the true flashpoint for the war came a year later when the new Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II, a devout Catholic, attempted to enforce religious uniformity throughout the empire. The result of all this was a war that would eventually pull in most of Europe's leading powers, and that led to widespread violence, famine, and a general collapse of order throughout most of Germany. This collapse in order is perhaps what Bartius himself refers to when he states it would be unwise to commit the book itself to a journey so long and full of perils. By 1665, however, the situation in Europe had stabilised, and it seems Marci was more than happy to dispatch the manuscript on the long journey from Prague to Kircher in Rome. So we now have the identity of the mysterious owner that Marci refers to in his letter. But how exactly did this Bartius come into the possession of the Voynich Manuscript? If we accept the words of this Dr. Raphael that it once belonged to the Emperor Rudolf II, then how exactly did it come to be owned by a comparatively minor official? Well, to answer these questions, we must start by examining Rudolf himself and what factors may have led him to first purchase the Voynich Manuscript, only to allow it to fall into the hands of an unknown alchemist. Born in 1552, Rudolf II was at the moment of his birth the heir to one of history's greatest dynasties. As a member of the powerful Habsburg family, he was directly in line to inherit the lands of Bohemia, Hungary, Croatia, and Austria, and was also a prime candidate for the imperial throne itself. But despite his high birth, Rudolf seems to have been a melancholy child, a characteristic likely enhanced by periods of estrangement between his parents, Archduke Maximilian of Austria and Archduchess Maria of Spain. Life was complicated further for Rudolf when at the age of 11 he was sent to be educated in Spain, then ruled by his uncle Philip II. These years in the highly conservative Spanish court would prove formative for Rudolf, instilling in him a manner that contemporaries described as aloof and secretive. In 1571, his father Maximilian, now the Holy Roman Emperor, would recall him to Vienna, where he was made co-ruler in his father's realms. 5 years later, Maximilian died suddenly of a heart complaint, and the 24-year-old Rudolf succeeded him as emperor. On paper, his father's death now made Rudolf the most powerful man on the continent, ruling over most of Central Europe. In reality, however, his authority remained unquestioned only in his hereditary domains of Austria, Bohemia, and the western parts of Hungary and Croatia. Elsewhere in the empire, his authority was far less certain. In Germany, his power had to compete with that of the regional princes, whilst in the Kingdom of Italy, the power of the emperor had been curtailed since the early 15th century. When it came to the exercise of power, however, Rudolf seems to have had little interest. Basing himself out of Prague, he spent most of his reign neglecting state affairs, instead focusing his attention on scholarly pursuits. Over the course of these pursuits, he would collect a circle of male favourites, whilst also making repeated purchases of books on alchemy and occultism, often paying far more than the 600 ducats he is claimed to have spent on the Voynich Manuscript. Luckily for us, the ledgers in which these purchases were recorded still exist, though their careful study has not yet revealed any purchase that matches the Voynich manuscript. However, it should be noted that these ledgers do not contain the large numbers of alchemical works that Rudolf is known to have possessed, and amongst which the manuscript is likely to have been housed. Many of the entries in these ledgers also refer to multiple volumes, and it remains possible that the manuscript was purchased at this time as part of a larger collection. In addition, there is another piece of evidence found within the Voynich manuscript itself that ties it more directly to Rudolf. It appears in the form of a badly faded signature written in the bottom margin of the first folio. So faded was this signature that it initially went unnoticed by Wilfrid Voynich upon his acquisition of the manuscript. It wasn't until sometime after 1914 that he was able to enhance it through the application of an unknown chemical. This signature was further enhanced by ultraviolet viewing in the late 2000s, and has now been confirmed to be that of one Jacobus Horchicha de Tepenec, an early 16th century alchemist of some repute. After receiving a Jesuit-backed education in chemistry, Horchicha was sent to the Clementium in Prague, where he quickly made a name for himself as a talented pharmacist. By 1607, his fame had grown such that he was called to the court of Rudolf II, who named him imperial chemist. Here Horchicha's true rise began, as he rapidly became a favourite of the reclusive emperor. In 1609, he is traditionally considered to have cured Rudolf of a grave but unspecified illness, an act for which he was rewarded the noble title de Tepenec. We also know that it was around this time he acquired the Voynich manuscript, perhaps as a gift from his patron. Upon receiving the manuscript, Horchicha promptly signed his name inside the first page, an act he is known to have performed for each book that came into his possession. After this, the manuscript presumably remained in his possession until his death in 1622, when it passed to Bartius by uncertain means. The result of all this is that we now have a rough chronology of the Voynich manuscript's earliest owners. After being purchased by Rudolf II at some unspecified point in his reign, it was then either gifted or fell into the possession of his favourite, Jacobus Horchicha. After Horchicha's death, the manuscript made its way into the hands of Bartius, though exactly how remains uncertain. Upon his own death sometime in the mid-17th century, Bartius in turn left the manuscript and the rest of his effects to Marci. Until this point, the manuscript seems to have remained within Prague. But Marci would change this, when in 1665 he sent the manuscript to Curcia in Rome. From the tone of two later letters, sent on Marci's behalf by his friend Gottfried Kinner, we can deduce that the manuscript made the journey unscathed. However, there is no evidence that Curcia made any further attempts to decode it, and it likely remained untouched in his library until his own death in 1680. From here, we enter a period of uncertainty for the Voynich manuscript. Over the next 2 centuries, its whereabouts are only vaguely known, while specific owners are difficult to come by. One thing we can say for certain, however, is that with the deaths of Bartius, Marci, and Curcia, the first serious attempts to decode the manuscript came to an end. From this point onwards, there is no knowledge of any attempt to decode the manuscript, nor would there be for more than 200 years. Before we explore this period, let us first consider the other end of the timeline. With the discovery of these early letters, it might have been hoped that they would hold some clue as to the manuscript's origins. But when it comes to who sold the manuscript to Rudolf, the trail falls cold. As detailed before, the only known reference to its purchase comes to us from Marci's 1665 letter, by the way of a man he identifies as one Dr. Raphael. This man has since been identified as Dr. Raphael Mirezovsky, who served as the Czech language tutor to Ferdinand III, and who would have been familiar with Marci from the Prague High Court, where they both worked as officials during the early 17th century. It is this Raphael that provided the first known claim of Roger Bacon's authorship, a claim that Marci may have repeated in his letter in order to entice Curcia's interest. This is because by the 17th century, Roger Bacon's reputation had changed dramatically among scholars. Originally a philosopher and natural scientist whose work had covered a wide range of interests, by the early modern period, Bacon had been recast as a magician and a holder of secret knowledge. During this time, he was most famous for his association with a story of a Brazen Head, which he had supposedly created using mechanical or even necromantic powers. According to the story, this head could answer any questions asked of it, with its speech being powered by what was described as an effusion of vapours. This claim of Roger Bacon's ownership would have a significant effect on early 20th century attempts to decipher the manuscript, and would remain a widely accepted theory for many decades afterwards. As enticing as this claim is, it is Dr. Raphael's other claim that is of interest to us here. According to Marcy, Raphael told him that Rudolf purchased the manuscript from an unnamed messenger. Over the years, a number of proposals have been put forward as to this person's identity. The most popular theory by far is that the manuscript was delivered to Rudolf by the English occultist and philosopher John Dee, who visited Prague in the 1580s and was at one point thought to have corresponded with the emperor. An alternative but similar hypothesis instead placed ownership of the manuscript on Dee's colleague Edward Kelly, who accompanied him to Prague and with whom he collaborated during his magical studies. Kelly was an occultist and self-declared medium with a habit of making outlandish claims regarding his alchemical abilities, and whose ears had previously been cropped for forgery. As a result of his presence alongside Dee, some scholars have theorised that the Voynich Manuscript is nothing more than an elaborate hoax perpetrated by the two, which they supposedly crafted to resemble a medieval manuscript, then fooled the emperor into purchasing. As enticing as it is, there are problems with this theory. We now know that these links were far less developed with the emperor than had previously been supposed. In fact, during their time in Prague, Dee is known to have made a poor impression on the famously stiff Rudolf, whose patronage he failed to secure. Furthermore, there is no mention of the transaction in Dee's famously detailed diaries, nor indeed is there any reference to the manuscript itself. Other scholars have also pointed to the possession by Dee of 630 ducats upon his leaving Prague, along with reminiscences by Dee's son Arthur of his father owning a book of hieroglyphics during his days in Prague. However, a more thorough reading of Dee's diaries shows that he actually had in excess of 2,000 ducats in his possession at this time, with the 630 ducats being a sum he handed over to his rival in front of witnesses. In addition, the hieroglyphic manuscript owned by Dee has since been located. Known as the Book of Soiga, it consists of a 16th century treatise on magic and contains 36 large tables of letters that Dee was unable to decipher. This manuscript was considered lost until the mid-90s, when 2 copies of the manuscript were discovered in the British Museum. The text of this manuscript has since been published, and thanks to the work of researcher Jim Reed's, its ciphers broken. Nonetheless, suspicion has remained on Edward Kelly, who successfully secured Rudolf's patronage in 1590, at which point he dispensed with Dee. Despite these suspicions, recent forensic evidence has effectively ruled out a 16th century origin point for the manuscript. For the moment, we are left with a likely but unsatisfying explanation, put forward by Voynich scholars Dr. Raphael Prinker and Dr. René Zandbergen, that the Voynich manuscript likely sat in some German or Italian monastery until it was noticed and picked up by one of Rudolf's emissaries. So for the moment, we have hit a dead end in tracing the origins of the Voynich manuscript. But what became of the manuscript on the other end of our timeline, after Kircher's death? Well, as mentioned before, this is where things become a little vague. We know that after his death, Kircher's library and archives were housed at the Collegio Romano in Rome. Over time, many of his former books and manuscripts would be split up amongst other collections, but despite this, scholars are confident that the Voynich Manuscript remained at the Collegium. The main evidence for this location is again found within the binding of the manuscript itself. Originally, the manuscript was bound onto a series of wooden boards, as was the style of most medieval manuscripts. However, between 1824 and 1870, large numbers of the manuscripts held at the Collegium were rebound. It appears that the Voynich manuscript was no exception, as its current parchment binding strongly resembles that of the other items within the collection. The missing pages of the manuscript may also have been lost at this time. Aside from this rebinding, the manuscript seems to have garnered little interest in the 2 centuries that followed Kircher's death, going largely unnoticed within the Collegium library. It may have remained this way if it wasn't for a drastic change in the political landscape of Italy, a change that would soon break the power of the Jesuits in Rome. In the decades leading up to the 1870s, European politics had been characterised by an upswell of national movements. After the defeat of Napoleon in 1815, the victorious great powers met at the Congress of Vienna, where they attempted to revert Europe to a state resembling that prior to the French Revolution. Italy was no exception, and it was soon returned to the patchwork of states that it had been comprised of prior to the 1790s. However, one of the side effects of Napoleon's Italian conquests was the increasing emergence of an Italian national identity, which in turn fueled political groups set on unification. By the 1860s, these groups had become full-scale revolutionary movements, and over the next decade, a series of independence wars would result in a unified country under the leadership of King Victor Emmanuel II of Sardinia-Piedmont. These wars culminated in 1870 with the fall of the city of Rome to Italian forces, a move which ended the temporal power of the Pope. The Jesuits at the Collegio Romano were amongst the first to feel the wrath of the new Kingdom of Italy. In 1873, its buildings and library were secularized by the new authorities, along with all of the society's other possessions. At this point, the Voynich manuscript could easily have fallen into the hands of the Italian government. However, the Jesuits were able to exploit a loophole that allowed them to save a portion of their collection. By attaching slips of paper bearing the name of the Jesuit general to the top of as many manuscripts as possible, they ensured that these volumes would be treated as his own private library, and thus avoid confiscation. After this, the exact location of the manuscript becomes unclear. It was most likely part of a collection of classical manuscript moved out of Rome at this time, with its most likely repository being that of the Villa Torlonia in Castel Gandolfo. This, however, would change sometime after 1903, when the Jesuit order entered negotiations to sell the collection to the Vatican. As with the Italian government before it, the Voynich manuscript could have easily disappeared into the Vatican archives, where it may have remained unknown to this day. But whatever the manuscript's presumed fate at this point, its sale would be interrupted by the intervention of perhaps the manuscript's most colourful owner. His road to ownership of the manuscript was a complicated one, but through the publicity he courted, the manuscript would soon be brought to worldwide attention. Born in 1865 in the Lithuanian town of Telšiai, then part of the Russian Empire, Miquel Habdank Voynich gave every indication of being a gifted child. Throughout the course of his early life, he would study law and then chemistry at the universities of Warsaw, St. Petersburg, and Moscow, the last of which he would graduate from in 1884. Alongside his studies, he was also increasingly drawn into the Polish nationalist movement. After graduating in 1884, Voynich returned to Warsaw, where he joined the Social Revolutionary Party, Proletariat. By 1886, the Tsarist police caught up with him, whereupon he was arrested and exiled to Siberia. Despite its hardships, this period of exile proved to be a valuable period of study for Voynich, who later described it as his second university. In 1890, however, he escaped from Siberia, later claiming to have fled first to Mongolia and China, before finally reaching Hamburg 5 months later. There he would barter his few remaining possessions, including his waistcoat and his glasses, in return for passage to England. Arriving in London in October 1890, Voynich soon found his position much improved. Adopting the name of Ivan Kelshevsky, he quickly integrated into the Polish exile community. Here he became part of the inner circle of one Sergei Kravchinsky, one of the leading opponents of the Tsarist regime. Better known by his alias Stepniak, Kravchinsky would introduce Voynich to the world of bookselling by making him the business manager of the Russian Free Press Fund, which published revolutionary propaganda throughout Russia. It was also through Stepniak that Voynich made his entrance into the higher circles of English society, where he would meet his future wife, the novelist Ethel Bull. Within a few years, however, Voynich was drifting away from the revolutionary cause. This estrangement came about through disagreements with other members of the fund, which Tsarist secret police reports from the time note were fueled by Voynich's own rude and overbearing behaviour. Soon these disagreements had become irreconcilable. In 1894, Voynich resigned from the fund, after which he seems to have abandoned active participation in the revolutionary cause. Instead, he focused his efforts on a new venture. Building on his experience as a bookseller, he swiftly moved into the antiquarian book trade. In 1894, he was able to set up a shop of his own on Soho Square, likely funding the venture using the profits that Ethel was now bringing in through her career as a popular novelist. From here, Voynich would quickly build a reputation as one of the leading members of his trade. The key to his success became his regular buying trips to the continent, where he was able to obtain large numbers of manuscripts at a discount price. Over the next 10 years, his business would expand rapidly. In 1902, he and Ethel were married after 10 years of living together as husband and wife. 2 years later, Voynich successfully applied for British citizenship, whereupon he adopted the first name of Wilfred. By 1905, he was able to move his shop to larger premises on Shaftesbury Avenue, where he adopted as his device an image of a cat playing with a mouse. Recollections by contemporaries from this time paint a vivid portrait of Voynich as a habitual chain smoker, liable to suddenly explode in anger at his employees, only to immediately apologise and attempt to placate his target with an invitation to lunch. By the early 1900s, Voynich's success had led to a change in his business practice. Shifting his attentions away from the cheaper items with which he had built his success, he instead turned his focus towards high-end illuminated manuscripts. It is somewhere around this time that he became aware of the collection of documents the Jesuit order was in the process of selling to the Vatican, and somehow managed to insert himself into this negotiating process. Little is known about what these negotiations entailed, other than that they were conducted in intense secrecy. Finally, after 9 years of bargaining, Voynich was allowed to purchase several items from the collection. Amongst these items, listed quite simply as a miscellaneous 15th century manuscript, was the enigma to which he would one day lend his name. Over the next decade, the cipher manuscript became the focus of Voynich's fascination. Throughout this time, he gradually sold off the other manuscripts in the collection, earning a small fortune for his patients. Of these documents, he came to refer to the cipher manuscript as the Ugly Duckling, believing that its decipherment would transform it into a high-demand item. He was aided in this conclusion by his discovery of Marcy's original letter to Kircher, tucked into the manuscript's cover, which contained Dr. Raphael's claims that the manuscript had been written by Roger Bacon. Focusing on this information, Voynich would suggest a 13th century origin for the manuscript, a point that would be accepted uncritically by scholars for decades to come. In aid of establishing this fact, Voynich reached out to one William Romain Newbold, who at the time was Professor of Intellectual and Moral Philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania. Newbold was equally fascinated by the manuscript, and in 1919 he began the first serious attempt to decipher its text since Johann Marcy sent the manuscript to Kircher over 250 years prior. By 1921, Newbold had produced what he believed to be the key to unlocking the manuscript. That same year, he and Voynich presented a provisional reconstruction of the manuscript to a meeting of the American Philosophical Society, where they endorsed the theory of Roger Bacon's authorship. A nationwide lecture tour would soon follow, during which Newbold expounded on his decipherment and briefly garnered himself a modicum of fame. Ever the businessman, Voynich also sought to maximise the manuscript's public profile during this time. By now, he had grown convinced that the manuscript held secrets of world-shattering importance, as shown by comments he made to an interviewer from the New York Times. Quote, "When the time comes, I will prove to the world that the black magic of the Middle Ages consisted in discoveries far in advance of 20th century sciences." End quote. Despite this publicity, the manuscript failed to entice buyers, likely due to the $100,000 price tag that Voynich demanded. Moreover, Newbold's decipherment claims, so boldly stated at the time, would soon come under serious scrutiny by the wider academic community. Towards the end of his life, even Voynich must have known that Newbold's decipherment was a false one. By this time, however, he had larger concerns to manage, as his business was beginning to run into difficulties. After the outbreak of World War I in 1914, Voynich had found himself unable to make the regular visits to the continent that his business required, and in order to compensate, he had switched much of his focus to the American antiquities market. That same year, he opened a second store in New York, and after a rocky start, this new source of trade began to pay dividends. After the end of the war in 1918, Voynich returned to his itinerant lifestyle, shuttling regularly between the US and Europe. Around the same time, his wife Ethel settled down in New York, from which point onwards she and her husband seem to have led separate lives. Voynich's business affairs and personal life instead came to be managed by his secretary, a woman by the name of Anne Nill, who would also cohabit with Ethel after her husband's death. This state of affairs continued successfully for much of the next decade. However, in the late 1920s, the antiquities trade would be hit hard by the sudden onset of the Great Depression. Voynich's sales quickly ground to a halt, and the company's growing debt forced him to stonewall his creditors' increasingly urgent demands for repayment. These problems were only complicated further by his growing ill health, which was exacerbated by a combination of his heavy smoking and the chronic tuberculosis that he had contracted in the Tsarist prisons decades prior. Despite these hardships, Voynich's interest in the cipher manuscript remained as strong as ever. In the final year of his life, he even made special arrangements regarding its future. In his will, he appointed a 5-member committee to oversee its future sale, in which he included both Ethel and Anne Nill, alongside 3 academic advisors. These arrangements proved timely, as in 1929, Voynich would be stricken by a bout of pneumonia whilst visiting England. On March 19, 1930, Wilfrid Michael Voynich passed away, aged 64. 4 months later, Ethel wrote the letter that was found enclosed with the manuscript after her death. In it, She outlined the known history of the manuscript and the circumstances under which her husband had acquired it. After writing on the envelope that it should only be opened after her death, she deposited both it and the manuscript in a safe deposit box on Fifth Avenue. Upon his death, Wilfrid Voynich's estate was split between Ethel Voynich and Anne Nill, who would remain companions for the remainder of Ethel's life. In order to save at least some of Voynich's business, they decided to wind down the London store. Afterwards, they continued to manage the New York store with moderate success for the rest of Ethel's life. For the next 3 decades, Ethel and Anne would also remain the primary custodians of the cipher manuscript. Under the conditions stipulated in Voynich's will, the manuscript could only be sold to a public institution, to whom its enormous price tag would likely have been daunting. As a result of this, the cipher manuscript remained within the bank vault until Ethel's death in 1960, after which Anne Nill inherited her share in the manuscript. The next year, she finally succeeded where the Voyniches could not, selling the manuscript, though for less than a quarter of the original $100,000 price. Later that same year, Anne Nill passed away at the age of 67. The new buyer was an Austrian book dealer by the name of Hans P. Krauss, who had long been fascinated by the Voynich manuscript. In order to acquire it, he pledged a half share in any future profit generated by the manuscript, along with a down payment of $24,500. Perhaps with recouping this sum in mind, he advertised the manuscript for sale in his Catalogue 100 at the princely sum of $160,000. To his surprise, there were no buyers. Quote, "I felt like Voynich, who had held the manuscript for such a long time. Dozens of scholars wanted to see it. Others asked for photos. Institutions asked to have it on loan. I had to decline all such requests to preserve its commercial value. There were no buyers." End quote. Krauss would spend the next 7 years attempting to sell the manuscript, a task he would ultimately find impossible. By 1969, he had given up. That year, he donated the manuscript to the Bernicki Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University, where it has remained the centre of study for the last 50 years. So after all of its long and storied history, what might the manuscript actually say? We've covered the early efforts of both Bartius and Johann Marci to decipher its text, along with their failed attempts to engage Athanasius Kircher in their pursuit. But what of modern efforts in that regard? As William Sherman states in his 2016 essay, the Voynich manuscript has attracted an extraordinary range of scholar adventurers over the last century. Often, these adventurers have been amateurs more interested in conspiracy theories than actual decryption. But along the way, the manuscript has also attracted serious cryptographical interest, often by the greatest minds of their day. Let's start with the earliest of these efforts, that of William Newbold in the 1920s. As we detailed before, he presented a draft translation of the manuscript alongside Voynich in 1921, where he confirmed his belief in Roger Bacon's authorship. On its face, Newbold's translation relied on a combination of a medieval cipher known to have been used in Bacon's alchemical manuscripts. Newbold also convinced himself that this cipher was supplemented by a far more complicated system, one that relied on widespread use of letter transposition, anagrams, and microscopic notation. Upon its initial announcement, this system received sympathetic treatment by John Matthews Manley, a renowned medievalist working at the University of Chicago. At that time, Manley was considered one of the world's premier codebreakers, having served as a US Army cryptographer during World War I. However, after Newbold's death, his working papers were published, prompting Manley to take a more detailed look. In the late 1920s, he would change his position, writing a scathing critique of Newbold's decipherment in a series of articles printed in both popular periodicals and academic journals. Quote, "I could not believe that a man with intelligence enough to construct so complicated a cipher could construct one that could not be trusted to convey his messages inevitably and unmistakably. That absolute certainty of interpretation was one of the first essentials of a good cipher, and that, inasmuch as experience has shown, even a group of less than 50 letters can be arranged in several thousand different ways, all forming intelligible human speech." End quote. This critique successfully discredited Newbold's proposed translation. However, this failure on Newbold's behalf would bear fruit in the decades ahead. During the early stages of his critique of Newbold's work, Manley reached out to a colleague to help confirm his assessment. This colleague was William F. Friedman. Dubbed the world's greatest codebreaker by historian David Kahn, Friedman had served as the US Army's top codebreaker during World War I, and in 1925 Manley put him in direct contact with Wilfrid Voynich. As with so many before him, Friedman was intrigued by the manuscript. Over the next 40 years, he would undertake an intermittent study of its contents, one that was marked by frustration. In 1939, this study was interrupted by the outbreak of World War II, during which Friedman formed a group of 16 US cryptologists with the goal of breaking the Japanese war codes. By the end of 1940, the code was cracked, and Friedman's team were free to devote their time to less urgent projects. In 1944, he initiated what is still considered the most professional attempt at deciphering the manuscript, known to Voynich scholars as the First Study Group. But despite the wealth of expertise on hand, no breakthrough was made, and in 1946, Friedman and the rest of his team were demobilised. Friedman would spend the rest of his life attempting to set up a second study group, but ultimately his attempts would fail. By the end of his life, he had abandoned the idea of the Voynich manuscript being a cipher at all, and after his death, his final conclusion was revealed in an essay to the journal Philological Quarterly. Quote, "The Voynich manuscript was an early attempt to construct an artificial or universal language of the a priori kind." End quote. Despite Friedman's disillusionment with the manuscript, other scholars continued to work on it. Around the same time as Friedman, a scholar named Theodore Peterson from the Catholic University of America obtained a photostatic copy of the manuscript from Ethel Voynich. Using this copy, he combined a full transcript of the manuscript's alphabet in 1944, though crucially this remained unpublished until after his death. Another partial transcription was produced during this time by cryptologist Prescott Currier. In 1976, it was Currier who also produced the first thorough computer analysis of the manuscript, demonstrating what he claimed were two separate languages within the manuscript. The 1970s would also bring a range of outlandish claims regarding the manuscript's content. In 1978, John Stoigo announced that he had broken the manuscript cipher. If we are to believe his claims, then the Voynich manuscript is actually a Ukrainian text devoted to Slavic theology, with its illustrations being unrelated to the text. A decade later, Leo Lebatov would come forward with a similarly fantastical claim. According to his translation, the manuscript is written in a modified form of Flemish, and contains the sole surviving document of the Cathars, a persecuted Christian sect that had existed between the 12th and the 14th century. Unsurprisingly, both translations were swiftly condemned by the larger Voynich community. Except for these claims, cryptographic interest in the manuscript had begun to wane by the late 1980s. However, a new invention would soon lead to a dramatic revival of interest in the manuscript, and lure a new generation of cryptologists to tackle its secrets. This same invention, known as the Internet, would also spread knowledge of the manuscript to a wider audience than ever before. In 1991, a computer specialist and cryptoanalyst by the name of James Gilligy set up the email discussion list voynich@rand.org, being joined in the endeavour by cryptography specialist James Reeds and Michael Rowe. Using Courier's earlier transliteration, the three of them produced an electronic version of the manuscript, which was made publicly available. A year later, Friedman's own transcription was discovered, and in 1996, researchers Gabriele Landini and René Zandbergen initiated the European Voynich Manuscript transcription project. This project developed a new transliteration alphabet for the manuscript, known as EVA, which made the text pronounceable in English for the first time. By the end of the 1990s, Zandbergen, Landini, and a Brazilian researcher by the name of Jorge Stolfi would also start to delve into the historical background of the manuscript. Collaborating with translator Philip Neal, it was they who successfully unearthed Kircher's later letters. Eventually, their findings outgrew the mailing list, and in 2004, René Zandbergen set up a website to document them, www.voynich.nu. This website remains to this day the most complete online repository on the topic. So here we end the winding road of attempts to decipher the Voynich manuscript. Beyond this point, theories and hypotheses regarding the manuscript's content multiply almost exponentially, and it would be impossible to document them all here. The reality, however, is that no widely accepted translation of the whole text has been produced, and that for the moment we are no closer to cracking the manuscript cipher than its earliest owners were 3 centuries ago. But putting this vast multitude of theories aside, what can we definitively say about its origins? Thanks to modern forensic techniques, the answer is more than might be expected. Let's start with the materials of the manuscript itself. As we mentioned before, the Voynich manuscript is written on medieval parchment. This would have been made by soaking animal skins in a bath of lime, after which the skins would have been stretched out and scraped with a knife until they were smooth. In 2009, 4 small sections of this parchment were sent to the Accelerator Mass Spectrometry Lab at the University of Arizona, where they underwent carbon-14 dating. All 4 samples gave matching results. With 95% certainty, we now know that the parchment of the Voynich manuscript originates somewhere between 1404 and 1438. This finding is important for 3 reasons. Firstly, it allows us to definitively eliminate the possibility of Roger Bacon's authorship, and it also casts further doubt on the involvement of either John Dee or Edward Kelly. It also makes it less likely that the manuscript was a fraud perpetrated by Voynich himself, as it would have been extremely difficult to gather such a quantity of matching medieval parchment with which to fashion such a fraud. Most importantly, however, it gives us a rough time frame for the manuscript's creation, information that may one day prove the key to filling the missing holes in its history. But despite these findings, we still can't narrow down the exact origin point of the manuscript. By this point, it had been long conjectured that the Voynich manuscript had a southern European origin point, due to one of the illustrations hidden within the bottom portion of what has been termed the rosette fold-out. Here a drawing of a castle is visible with a strange series of swallowtail battlements, which resemble those of northern Italian castles of the 14th and 15th centuries. This illustration was enough for some researchers to suggest a northern Italian origin point. During the 15th century, goatskin was the primary material used for manufacturing parchment in this region, and to confirm whether this was the material used to produce the Voynich manuscript, amino acid sequencing work was conducted at the University of York. Here 10 separate samples of the manuscript's parchment all gave the same conclusive answer. The Voynich manuscript is written on calfskin. Now, unlike goatskin, calfskin was widely used as a writing material throughout most of Europe, and thus it cannot be used to narrow down the manuscript's parchment to one particular origin point. Unfortunately for us, the additional forensic data that has been gleaned from the manuscript does little to alter this situation. The text of the manuscript has been determined to have been written in iron gall ink, which was commonly used throughout Europe during both the Middle Ages and Renaissance. Multispectral imaging work has similarly failed to uncover any hints in the pigments of the illustrations themselves. For the moment, all that we can say with certainty is that the manuscript was likely created somewhere in Northern Europe during the early 15th century, though we cannot rule out that the text itself could have been composed later. So what might the Voynich manuscript actually say? Well, the answer is probably a disappointing one. From the nature of its illustrations, it seems likely that the Voynich manuscript is a simple medical workbook, likely created by a 15th century practitioner. Hoping to protect the secrets of his trade, he wrote them down in a language of his own devising, never realising that in doing so, he was creating one of the great mysteries of human history. This theory is a mundane one, but thanks to a new discovery, all indications are that it is correct. I chose to omit this piece of evidence earlier, but there is in fact one small portion of the Voynich manuscript that many scholars agree has been translated, and it supports this theory. This text appears as a note at the very end of the manuscript on folio 116v. According to Johannes Albus, who presented the solution on the centenary of Voynich's original purchase of the manuscript, this section is written in a combination of abbreviated Latin and medieval German, and outlines a traditional wound plaster made from goat's liver. This conclusion is supported by the presence of a small drawing of a goat in the margin next to the text, though it should be noted that not all scholars agree with this translation. Crucially, this section also contains 2 characters from the main Voynich text, though this translation has yet to result in the decoding of the main text. But as mundane as the manuscript's content may prove to be, this hasn't stopped it from capturing the popular imagination. To this day, the Voynich manuscript remains one of Yale's most popular online attractions, with the digital version of the manuscript accounting for 11% of traffic to its digital library. In popular culture, the manuscript has also inspired a multitude of fantasy and science fiction novels, along with popular TV shows and even symphony orchestras. In the late 1970s, the artist Luigi Serafini was inspired by the manuscript to produce his own cipher document. Known as the Codex Seraphineus, it too contains a large number of surreal and often fantastical imagery, alongside copious amounts of false writing. With all of this continuing interest, it seems likely that the Voynich manuscript will one day be cracked and its secrets divulged upon the world. Until then, it remains one of the holy grails of cryptography, and a powerful symbol of knowledge hidden in plain sight.